Hello, this is the RPG Pundit, final boss at Internet Shitlords, and this is another totally unannounced live stream, so I'm presuming that we're going to get hardly anyone actually coming on, but hey, that's alright. Yeah, I'm just gonna be, you're gonna have to bear with me a little while. I set things up here. Oh, there's some people coming in already. Hey. So today I'm gonna be preparing my coffee, and hey, my cat's here. Look at that. What you can see of her. Oh, she's heading off somewhere. I think I know what she's interested in. Yeah, what is this? The things I do for ratings. What is that? Oh, it's a little. What's going on? Hey, watch the camera. Hey. What's that? What's that light? It's a giant mouse. It's a giant mouse. Oh my god! It's a giant mouse. Yeah, she likes her mouse. She's clever. Alright, so today we're going to be talking. Oh, she caught it. Good job. Good job. Yeah. Today we're going to be talking about terrible pandering. Yeah, besides terrible pandering, we're going to be talking about the question of violence in RPGs and how there's a certain crowd of people. They've been here like since forever. This isn't something you can really blame on exactly modern SJWism. But there's always been this group of people that have tried to act as though their games that have less violence are somehow superior to RPGs that focus a lot on combat. And this happens both at the level of the campaign and at the level of RPG design, like, you know, settings and games and such, right? So that you'll often hear somebody say, oh, this game is so innovative because it barely even has combat at all, you know, as though that somehow makes it a superior design to a game that dedicates, you know, I don't know, 50 pages to combat, right? I wouldn't like either of those particular extremes myself, right? You don't necessarily want, I'm not arguing in favor of rampant realism here, right? There's some kind of like obsession with trying to make everything as mechanically complete, and much less stuff like what we could call gun porn, right? Where people are just going crazy about, you know, getting the mechanics of, you know, whether, you know, this type of gun does a D6 or a D6 plus 1, and then this other one does a D6 plus 2, and so on and so forth, right? And that sort of stuff has never interested me. So in a way, I'm the worst person to be talking about this. In another sense, that makes me the very best person to be talking about this. Because this isn't me talking as a, you know, a big fanatic of, you know, heavy combat RPGs. My water's about to boil here. So I've had a lot of games where there's been basically very little combat at all. And, you know, both in like individual campaigns or whatnot, or just sessions, right? Some you can have a really memorable session of having no actual fighting happening, but a whole bunch of other stuff that makes it really interesting, right? Somebody here brought up aces and eights. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about aces and eights later. And this is very interesting because aces and eights is a game where combat is incredibly important. It doesn't happen in every session. And every time it happens, it's extremely dangerous, right? And in some ways, that makes it absolutely perfect. It makes it perfect for the genre you're trying to emulate, which is the, you know, the Wild West. And it also makes it perfect in terms of what you actually want in a combat system. But basically, let's start with the other side here, which is you get these people who have, you know, they've got this classic inherited liberal aversion to this idea of violence or what have you. All of this, I think it goes back to Rousseau. Rousseau was the guy who talked about, you know, the noble savage and the, you know, the idea man is fundamentally good, but he's conditioned to be bad. And this is something that the left has adopted wholeheartedly, and ever more so. And so it's this idea, until very recently anyways, because now they're kind of going back on that and suggesting that there are certain, you know, races and genders that are just inherently evil and have no way to actually be cured of evil. But for a long time anyways, the left had this notion that if we were all just the way we were naturally meant to be, like if we were all hippies hanging out on the commune, then everything would be totally groovy, man, and, you know, wavy gravy, and we'd all just be making love and eating natural stuff, you know, putting wildflowers in our hair, and there'd be nothing bad that would ever happen, right? So all the evil stuff, anything that's scary, is actually a product of big bad society that's manipulated us, right? Have you ever thought about scheduling my shows so that the 20 are here in time for my intro? Yeah, well, that would require competence, wouldn't it? I mean, you're asking a bit too much of the pundit here, my friend. I am not good at organizing this sort of stuff. Putting some yogurt here. So, you know, I know I should. And sometimes I swear I will. And hey, if I was getting... Oh, crap. Just dropped my coffee. It's okay, no harm done. If I was getting more of your delicious Patreon dollars, then, you know, I probably would end up taking this all more seriously, right? But for the moment, at least, I don't know. I'm doing this. I do this once a week. I do it because there's a good response. Obviously, this channel has been growing. It's been getting lots of views. But it is kind of hard for me, you know. Right now, I could be doing this, or I could be doing, I could be working on my RPG Pundit Presents series, which is where I'm getting some actual money, right? What's my Patreon threshold? Well, I don't know. I haven't thought about that. I suppose that if I was, you know, I guess if I don't know if I even want people to be paying me on Patreon, though. That's part of the problem too. But I guess if I was making, you know, $100 a month, then I'd probably, yeah, if I was doing $50 a month, I'd probably be more serious about trying to have like one live stream a month that I schedule in advance, that people know is coming, so that they're all here and watching. I could probably do that. If I had $100 a month, then I'd probably be doing, you know, 1 or 2 videos a week, one of which could be a live stream, and, you know, stuff like that. I do like the dopamine hits. That's true. There's no question. Subscribestar is working now, I think. I've heard, I was talking about this with some people, and who know Sargon and stuff, and from what I've heard, it seems that Subscribestar is operating again. They seem to have found ways to make payments, but I don't know if they're actually taking new members, because for a while they weren't, you know. So it's kind of a bit complicated. You guys could also send money direct through PayPal. If you go, I'm gonna provide the link at the end of the live stream here. I'll put it in the description, or you can look at the description of any of my other videos. If you go to my blog, then on the right-hand side of the blog, there's a PayPal button. And if you want to be generous with PayPal, then that would be great too. But anyway, yeah. So I know I should be putting more organized effort into this, and I hope I will. I also think we're still at a stage where we're building our way up. We are now past the 700 subscriber mark, and I'm very pleased about that, and I want to thank everyone who subscribed. The more that these videos are shared, then the more likelihood that they'll be some more people signing in, and you know, when you get up past the 1,000 subscriber mark, then stuff starts happening more quickly, and then I'd really have to start taking this seriously too, right? So you got kind of two options here. If you want me to be more organized, to schedule these live streams, to do more videos in the month, support me on Patreon or on PayPal. I'll look into Subscribe to Our. Someone put the link just there, but I'm kind of trying to wait to see what Jordan Peterson comes up with, because I think I trust him more than some kind of fly-by-night Russian website, right? Which I think is what Subscribestar is. I'm not 100% sure if they're Russian, but the other qualities kind of match there. But anyway, I'll see. I do eventually want to leave Patreon, but support me on PayPal, on Patreon, or wherever you'd like to support me, that I can get to anyway. That's one option. Second option is the second option is that you end up sharing this video and helping me to build up the subscribers, right? So someone just posted something there in the chat. I can't see the chat now. Said you must copy paste your title into your description box and tags box. Use that tags box. It works. I don't know. I'm not sure what the tags box is there. You can tell I'm a technological illiterate, can't you? But well, I do put, you mean when I'm doing the description, I do put like the descriptive tags at the bottom. Like, I don't know if I'm talking about D&D and the OSR, I'll put D&D, I'll put OSR down there, and stuff like that. Is that what you meant there, Axeblade? Anyway, we were talking, until it got derailed here, we were talking about this question of violence in RPGs and the mentality some people have. Yeah, edit info on YouTube. I think we're talking about the same thing, Axeblade. And the attitude some people have that having violence in RPGs is somehow bad, demeaning, wrong, or just lesser than RPGs that are spent in, you know, more sophisticated pursuits, which is just bullshit, right? No, Catboy is not dead yet. However, Catboy was recently defamed, but that's as much as we've gotten to so far, Zulu. I'm sorry to tell you. Default tag added Livestream too. Okay, I'll try to understand what you're talking about later there. I don't understand those words. I know they are words, but I don't know what they mean. Yeah, remember, you guys are dealing with the Neanderthal here. So we were talking about Rousseau, and Rousseau had created this idea that man is inherently good and that it's only society that makes him bad, right? This is kind of ridiculous when you consider Rousseau's own life, where he basically murdered his own children just because he didn't feel like having them, you know? So it's kind of ironic that this asshole would be the one trying to present the notion that man is inherently good. You know, he's the living example that it isn't. But this idea went on through the ages and into it went deep into the very philosophical core of the left, right? Especially, I think, as it's a repudiation of a fundamental concept of the right, which is, you know, original sin, right? In the Western right, the traditional religious right is Christian, of course, and they have this notion that mankind is inherently sinful, inherently wicked, right? The heart is deceitful above all things, right? We are filled with wickedness, and we have to, you know, it's only through divine intervention that we can be saved from our wickedness, right? So this is like the exact opposite argument, right? It's saying, no, everything was perfect when we were just following our actual nature, but it's like other people and our societal constraints and the complications of existence and impressions and events that happen in our lives that make us evil. Axeblade, original sin is not just Catholic. Original sin is an element of absolutely all Christian denominations, as far as I know. I mean, except maybe some of the real hippie ones that don't count anyways. But anyway, this is the opposite, right? It's saying No, mankind is fundamentally good, and it's just bad influences that do. So that gives you two bonuses. First is you get to repudiate traditional Western religion. You get to repudiate the whole Christian conception of original sin. And that's a big deal for these people, right? And then second, you get to present this idea that it's actually just, hierarchy, the patriarchy, the authorities, and just generally all of this kind of the capitalism, anything that you want to, you can blame it on being what makes otherwise good people turn bad, right? So this is, hey, Big Fat Polly. I like that name. Anyway, this is the big appeal to being able to then say, well, you if we can just abolish some of these things, right? If we can abolish these elements of human nature, then, which we don't think is human nature, we think it's social conditioning, then we're going to make everything utopian, right? And so obviously one of these things is the inclination towards violence, even when that inclination towards violence is directed in ways that are productive or at least non-destructive, right? So violence can be directed into competition in sports, right? Violence can be directed into play, right? Into role-playing games, video games. It can be directed into entertainment, satisfying the kind of instinct for violence through watching, a gory film or something like that. And it's not surprising at all that as much as some of these things also get condemned by elements of the moral right, all throughout recent years, including in the 1980s, right, when we usually think of that, it was the right that was persecuting violent video games and comic books and movies and role-playing games and heavy metal music, there's a whole contingent to the left that was routinely doing a similar thing, right? And of course, nowadays, they're the ones that are doing it the most openly and the most directly. So there's this idea about violence that it's something that is not that it's a harmful thing to be exposed to and to have other people exposed to, because it'll somehow promote further violence, right? This notion that you see all the if you're playing Grand Theft Auto, you might decide to steal a car, which is just stupid, right? But there's also, in all of this all comes back towards these French philosophers who were massive hypocrites and thought they were better than everybody else, right? This is the left continuing to feel like they're better than everybody else, right? So you have this notion that, well, yeah, normal people will play D&D and go and kill orcs and things like that, but we sophisticates are beyond that sort of thing. So our role-playing games don't have all this gory fighting in it. You don't want to encourage fighting in a role-playing game, right? When of course, a normal person would say fighting is a good part of the fun of a role-playing game, right? And that there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. But furthermore, there's implied in that statement that, the great unwashed are the ones that like that sort of thing, that they like this senseless violence in role-playing games, and that we sophisticates are the ones who like to have these other things, these other styles of gaming, doing whatever, whether it's playing university professors with sexual hang-ups or, teenage girls on a smoke break outside of a fast food restaurant or whatever role-playing bullshit they come up with, right? Thinking that that's somehow inherently superior. And that, of course, reinforces their notion that they, as the pseudo-intellectual elite, are inherently superior to ordinary people, ordinary gamers, ordinary human beings, right? It's fundamentally a type of elitist thinking, right? Now, I'm saying all of this as someone who has run games that have had a lot of combat and other games that had hardly any combat. I'm certainly not saying that the only sort of game that you want to have is a game that is just a constant, slugfest where you're practically playing a war game, going through one room to another, just killing the monsters there, getting the treasure. That could be, you could do that, right? I think it gets boring after a while. But it's a completely valid way to play D&D, but it's also not by any means the only right way to play D&D. And it's certainly not the only right way to play something like, the Dark Albion setting, where I've got, you've got all this sort of element of political and social role playing that you could involve yourself in. So before anyone says, oh, pundits just attacking, any kind of role playing that isn't mindless orc bashing. No, I'm not. And none of the games I've designed are games that are inclined towards mindless orc bashing, right? I'm not saying that's bad. What I'm saying is that if you're playing a really sophisticated game in a Game of Thrones style thing in Dark Albion, where you've got your characters intricately involved with the political intrigues of the Lancastrian or Yorkist court, and aligning themselves with different noble houses, and there's a romantic subplot, and you're doing all that stuff, and maybe having no more than one duel a week, right? That is not inherently better than having a party in, Mystara or Greyhawk going through the caves of chaos, right? Neither one of those is better than the other. That's my fundamental position here. And the mentality that it's better is it's a harmful mentality, really, to everybody, because it comes back to that idea of Rousseau's notion of social engineering, right? That if we just make people not be violent, if we can just discourage people from being exposed to violence, and somehow their inherent natural goodness will come out, right? Which is nonsense. And of course, most of the swine in the gaming hobby these days don't really want to discourage other people from playing violence, except in the sense of wishing to ruin their fun. So when they try to encourage a game to be about less violent gaming, it's not really because they want to better other people. They always want to be the tiny group that are the social elites above everybody else, right? So of course they don't want everybody else to actually learn anything. But what they want is to punish people for what they like, because they think what those other people like is inferior to what the social elite like, right? And you see this in D&D. You often see this as a criticism of D&D as a whole, right? It's first and foremost, that's where it appears. People who play games that aren't D&D will claim, oh, D&D isn't good for anything other than fighting, right? In other types of games besides D&D, what did someone... I don't know why these things always disappear too fast. SJW is a 2010 version of the religious right from the 80s and 90s. Yes, I did a video about that. You can find it if you look through my earlier videos. And now someone said, oh, come on. I think something that we're all missing is the factor of age. Show me a 19-year-old pacifist who's a success. Yeah. It's good to have a way to do conflict on all those levels. My players want to bash orc heads. So many good sessions featured heroic combat. Yeah, that's a very good point. That point comes from Dr. Spider, I think that is. Okay. So Dr. Spider has a very good point there, which is that there's another aspect of this, is that combat often leads to heroism. And we wouldn't want that, would we? I mean, certainly the left doesn't want anything even vaguely resembling Trapdoor Spider. Thank you. Trapdoor Spider's got a very good point, because certainly the left wouldn't want anything resembling heroism in role-playing games, right? Which is why, for example, their ideal game, which is what I was going to get to talking about next here, is outside of D&D games. You have Call of Cthulhu, right? Call of Cthulhu is a game based primarily on a series of short stories by H.P. Lovecraft. Almost all of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with this, about horrible tentacle monsters, of which the primary story of that mythos, the one that has Cthulhu in it, is resolved by somebody ramming a goddamn steamship into Cthulhu and dropping him, okay? And yet, in this game, we are told over and over again by these, supposed illuminates who want to govern our lives, that you can't run a Cthulhu game by just going around shooting at everything. No, that's not the right way to do it. The right way to do Cthulhu, even though it's nothing like in the short stories, which the short stories are full of FBI raids and killing and shooting and all of that, right? They're basically a variation of pulp, right? And pulp is action-filled and heroic, right? The idea that these people have of how Cthulhu should be run as a game is that you're playing a group of university professors or, you know, dilettantes or whatever who discover something weird and start investigating it, and they investigate until they find the terrible monster, and then they all die, right? That's the idea. You aren't supposed to actually fight the great evil. The lesson you're supposed to learn from this is that humanity is inevitably doomed and we should all give up, right? We should all just give in to our cynicism, to our nihilism, right? The nihilism is the real terror in Lovecraft's novels, right? He's presenting a world that has no meaning, that has no purpose. And the problem is that the SJWs have basically embraced a world that has no meaning and has no purpose. And so they're, you know, to them, that's the point, right? Instead of fighting against this thing, which is the point for most normal people, right? And the funny thing is, a lot of people have, you know, because the Call of Cthulhu RPG has become so successful, people kind of assume that the sort of play that has been forced into Call of Cthulhu, in part by the writing, but also by the push, the social push of all of these people, these so-called elitists, Lovecraft elitists, you could say, or Cthulhu elitists. They don't really like Lovecraft. They hate Lovecraft, right? But Cthulhu elitists, let's call them, the pro-Cthulhu party. They want the annihilation of humanity. That you might think, if you've never read any of Lovecraft's novels, you might think just by playing the game that that's what the genre is like, right? And it's influenced the genre. This game ended up being very influential to the rest of the genre because a lot of people actually had their first, you know, the first time they ever heard of Cthulhu was through the role-playing game. They've never read any of the books, right? But if you read the books are totally different. Yes, there are some stories that are basically guy sneaks up on dark, sinister things, slowly starts discovering it, and then it eats him, right? There are those stories, of course, in Lovecraft. But there's also a ton of stories where, you know, by Lovecraft, by Howard, and by others, where the obvious answer is to fight, and where you're supposed to fight, right? And this is like a complete, the game itself is a complete denial of that, right? So it's like the game is telling you to do something different than what the actual source material says. So that's how they manipulated other games. With D&D, it has the unique quality that, for the most part, up till now, D&D was because it was the most popular game, it was automatically the most hated by the SJWs, who don't really like gaming. They don't really like the gaming hobby as it exists. And so D&D was always, you know, enemy number one. And so the slur on D&D was always, it's just a game for fighting. It's just a game for combat. So it's the stupid game. And the whole thing was to use D&D as the example of, you know, lowbrow, violent gaming that couldn't possibly do anything more sophisticated than that, even though it always has. And to push it aside, right? And say instead you should play this other thing. You should play Call of Cthulhu and be a Victorian butler and end up being murdered by a tentacle thing, because you could have a 98% gun skill, but you shouldn't use it, right? If you use it, then that's like you've lost the game. So D&D was for a long time meant to be that, right? It was the black mark. It was the bad guy. Now we've kind of gotten into a problem in recent years, which is that there's been an enormous resurgence of the popularity of D&D, the popularity of role-playing games. And you can't, it's not like before when there was D&D and a bunch of other role-playing games. Now it's basically the distance between D&D and its nearest competitors, as it is just massive, right? It didn't used to be that big of a distance. In the 80s, D&D was by far the most popular RPG, of course, but you could bring up any of these other games and there would be more people trying them. Now, there's an enormous amount of gamers, of people coming in who play D&D and who only know D&D. Only the D&D books are available to them in the bookstore where they buy it, because they're not buying it in a comic store or a gaming store, because those are dying out. They're buying it at Barnes and Noble or Chapters or whatever the equivalent is in their country, or they're even just ordering it on Amazon because they've seen it being used in Critical Role or something like that, right? So people aren't being exposed even to these other alternatives, and for the most part, the SJWs have given up on those alternatives because their big push for this was the Forge movement and story gaming, and it basically failed, right? People didn't want to play their kind of games. They even managed to change D&D in 4th edition. As I mentioned in my last video, they changed it into the type of game that they always said it was, a game that was basically for set-piece miniature combat, right? And that's not something that worked, and instead 5th edition came along, and instead 5th edition was a game that is massively focused on the possibility of role-playing, right? Role-playing in every sense, right? This was something I strongly encouraged when I was the, consultant for 5th edition. 5th edition is a game that is intentionally incoherent, because that was the criticism that the story gamers made of that it's incoherent, that it should be just a game for combat because that's all it's really good for, but it's always had these little parts that have been kind of, in the way of that, in the form of, simulation of worlds and role-playing, right? But I said, no, that's what most people want. Most people want all three things. They want combat, they want world discovery, and they want role-playing and character development. Those are the three things that most people want some of at some of the time. There might be a few people that only want one of those things, or that mostly only want one of those things. But your average gamer wants certain portions of all of those things, okay? And that's why 5th edition was hugely successful. It was so successful, though, that they can't really end up saying to people, no, don't play D&D, go play this other game instead. That just doesn't work anymore. So what we're seeing now is this impulse to trying to emasculate, you could say, D&D, right? To try to as much as possible, remove the emphasis on combat from D&D, remove the emphasis on violence, remove the emphasis on heroism. You see this plain as day whenever you do a search on the D&D tag on Twitter, where you're going to see all these images of people's characters, and their characters look like something out of a cutesy poo cartoon, right? And you realize that these people, those of whom are actually gaming at all, because many of them are not, the ones who are even actually gaming are having sessions that don't look anything like what D&D normally looks like, right? They're games of, chit chat and drama and oh my god, so random, and maybe if you're lucky, you'll get like some kind of really easy fight against some orcs or something. And there's kind of a flaw in this that's a part of, I think, what encourages this in 5th edition, which is that in 5th edition, there are very little consequences for combat, right? Ironically, games that are the most exciting for combat are games where there are consequences for combat. And in 5th edition, unless you have a total party kill, chances are your characters are going to be they're going to be okay in a fight, right? It's between the threshold of death being so high and between recovering of hit points being so easy in 5th edition with the rests, right? That you can take a rest and you're basically going to heal yourself. It means that combat loses a lot of its edge. And that means it makes it less interesting. And so it encourages people to spend more time, having Tumblr drama as part of their role playing in the game, right? So you're getting terrible role playing and you're getting terrible combat. On the other hand, you have in a game where you have combat that's really violent and really dangerous, like OSR games, right? Then combat becomes more meaningful, even though it becomes also riskier and there's much greater chance of death, right? In Lion and Dragon, even more so than in regular D&D, combat is a very dangerous thing to get into, because in any OSR game, in any old school game of D&D, you can very easily get yourself killed at low levels, because if you're playing a first level fighter in some versions of old school D&D, it is theoretically possible you'll be a first level fighter with 1 hit point. So you get hit once, and in some versions of the game, when you go to 0 hit points, you're dead, and that's it. So in some games, any single hit could kill that fighter, right? In theory. Normally, fighters aren't that weak, but it could happen in some versions of the game, right? And in most OSR games today, what you have is a little bit different than that, right? But you see nowhere near the amount of hit points and nowhere near the amount of threshold for survival that you see in other games. And Lion and Dragon takes that a little one notch further, even though in Lion and Dragon, you start at 0 level as a 0 level character with 1d6 hit points and no real skills. You end up, you have some skills that are like typical medieval skills, not combat skills. And then after your first adventure, if you survive, you become a first level character. Now, a first level character in Lion and Dragon is a little bit more competent than a typical first level character in other OSR games. They have a few more hit points because they got that D6 hit points in 0 level. But in spite of that, and in spite of there being something of a death threshold, because you can get to like -3 hit points and still have a chance of being saved by someone with medical skills, there's another thing in Lion and Dragon, which is a critical system. And the criticals are based on a critical table, and that table can be really vicious, right? So this means that you can have a 9th level knight, right? And he could be fighting 0 level peasants, and 1 lucky arrow shot could kill him. Just like we saw endless times in, the 100 Years' War and the War of the Roses and the great wars of the medieval period. So that's why I made it that way. And this means that anytime you get into combat, it's very dangerous. And my players in my L&D campaign, in my Dark Albion campaign, in my new Lion and Dragon campaign that I'm running now, they all know this. And so that means they have a healthy respect for getting into combat. It also means combat is more exciting for them. And it means they have to really think through it. But it means that they like it more, right? Even though there's a much bigger chance in there than in 5th edition that they're going to die, right? That makes it very exciting, right? You're ironically going to see this situation, it being the reverse of when you make a game that makes it too easy to fight, then fighting isn't all that interesting, right? So this is a sort of game that is ideal. A game like Lion and Dragon, or most OSR games, are ideal for combat and therefore going to be hated by the SJW crowd. Now, somebody here asked me about Boot Hill. I was kind of looking at the comments as I went along. And Boot Hill, it's okay, but it's not really, my preferred game. The game I've been running a campaign of for, I think, 2 or 3 years now, is Aces and Eights, which is not exactly an OSR game, but it's kind of close. It's done by Kenzer, the people that did Hackmaster, and it's kind of recognizable to D&D. Like you kind of see the similarity, but it's also kind of different, right? And the big thing about Aces and Eights is that it's excellent for running a totally straight historical Wild West campaign. And that's exactly what I'm running. And of course, in this game, that means that combat can be very deadly, right? You have a certain amount of hit points, but the hit points don't matter that much. The hit points are just there so that if a person manages to get a ton of little tiny shots on you, they could kill you by just the accumulated injury of a bunch of buckshot or something, or a bunch of little hits. But that very rarely happens. Most of the times, people will die long before they get to 0 hit points in Aces and Eights. And that's because when you get hit, first of all, there's this really neat like target map mechanic where you have to aim to a certain spot, and then depending on how badly or how well you did it, if you did really well, you're hit exactly where you plan to shoot. So if you're shooting at the guy's hand, or if you're shooting at the guy's head, or wherever, if you get a 25, dead on target, that's where you go. And if not, then you varied, right? And so when you get further away from the target, and there's a random chance of where on the wheel at that ring you're going to end up. So you might miss, you might hit, you might nick him, you might hit him in a totally different spot than you intended. We had one time when we had 2 player characters, one of the only times that they got into a duel with each other. And this one guy who was famous for shooting people right in the head from the first shot, Kid Taylor, right? He took he did a hip shot and he would blow out a guy's head, right? And he went and he did a hip shot, but his plan, because this guy was his friend that he was fighting with, Crazy Miller, he planned to shoot him in the hand, and he didn't roll high enough, and on the random kind of effect of where it ended up in the circle, it ended up hitting Crazy Miller right in the head. Now, Crazy Miller managed to survive because the damage was low enough, which is the other part of this. In aces and eights, when you roll damage, the damage level, so you do 5 damage. Okay, that's 5 hit points of damage, but that's not really what matters. You look at the table, based on where you were hit, the severity of 5 points of damage has a bunch of effects, right? And in this game, if you get to 9 or 10, depending on where you were, you're dead, right? If you get to 8, 7, or 6 points of damage, then that's already really serious, right? You're probably going to have long-term effects because of what happened. You might limp for the rest of your life, or you'll lose ability score points or stuff like that. But so like one shot that does 9 or 10 points of damage, which is a rifle can very easily do 2d6 for damage on a roll, and any shot to the head is doubled, remember, so you double the number of dice you roll. So it's very easy for someone to die in a gunfight in aces and eights, right? And in aces and eights, the emphasis is not really only on combat, right? At least not in my campaign. My campaign has been this kind of historical overview of the whole Wild West, and player characters have had all kinds of activity that they've been involved in. Even the lawmen have a lot of their activity involves, investigation, or trying to keep the peace between rival bands or things like that. But there's usually some kind of a fight. Not always. We just came out of a period of like 3 sessions where there wasn't a single gun duel, right? That was like after the OK Corral, which is kind of a big gun duel. But there's usually some kind of a small fight somewhere. And the thing about these small fights is that you can definitely die in one of those small fights. And to me, aces and eights embodies like one of the most perfect balances of just what you want combat to be. It doesn't have to be the whole game. In fact, in a game like aces and eights, or even, for example, Lion and Dragon, if you're just doing one constant combat after another, it's very unlikely that your characters are going to be able to live through it, right? But the combat is really exciting when it happens, and it really matters, right? We just had Jeff Young, a character from the Aces and Eights campaign, who because of a series of good rolls and good skill or whatever, he ended up being basically one of the greatest gunmen alive, right? There were, apart from Jeff Young, who was one of the player characters, there was probably only Johnny Ringo and Doc Holliday could beat him in a straight gunfight, right? In a straight draw, right? So he was an amazing shot in terms of, a gun duel or what have you. Super fast, super accurate. And he got into a stupid fight with some Comancheros when they were, when they were in a posse. And so it was this fight in this forest, and there was trees, and he got behind a tree for cover, but then there was a guy behind him, and when he turned to shoot at that guy, there was a guy behind a rock. The guy behind the rock now had a slight, he basically had exposed part of his head, part of his chest, and one of his arms, and the guy took the shot, and he shot, and the shot went right through Jeff Young's heart, and he died, right? The guy was by far a superpower in the game, right? Like, he was the guy who was the best fighter in the game, and he died in one single shot, just like that. And that means that in the sense of the excitement of combat and the importance of combat, you put pressure, you put weight on it, right? So my perspective on violence in RPGs is that violence in RPGs is a very fun thing, and it's a very good thing. And I certainly think that anyone who suggests that you don't need to have it is just stupid, right? Or that you shouldn't have it, rather. You don't need to have it, absolutely, but it's a lot more fun, generally, if there is some. But if you're going to have some, then the best thing to do is make it exciting. And the way you make it exciting is by making there be real consequences, right? There has to be risk. And within the context of that matter of risk, there has to be kind of this opportunity for triumph or for death, right? And that's something that when we make games that make it too easy to fight, to get, to have characters where combat doesn't really matter very much, that's how we end up with this kind of like Tumblr D&D, right? with these, oh, look at my dragonborn boy and this tiefling who's he's just a sweetheart, right? And that they put these pictures on Twitter of these characters that you look at them and you're like, well, yeah, this isn't being used in any kind of a heroic fashion. That's blatantly obvious, right? So if we want to emphasize this, the way to emphasize it is to make it matter. And when you make it matter, that also destroys the argument of, definitely fuck Tumblr and Dragonborn and Tieflings as playable characters. But if you have this element of heroic fantasy in your game, right, or heroism in your game, then that's something that makes it important. If you have the idea of stakes in your game, that makes it important that it's worth something, and that destroys the argument that the other side has that D&D is just meaningless violence. It's not meaningless violence, at least not a well-run game. A well-run game of D&D should never be meaningless violence. It should be violence with meaning, right? Because violence can have meaning. The argument that the other side makes, the argument that the SJWs makes, is that violence never has meaning. Unless you're punching Nazis. But even then, they know that that's not true. It doesn't have meaning. It's just their way of excusing the political violence they want to inflict on their enemies, right? Where they can call anyone a Nazi and then punch them, and then that makes it okay, right? It's not really because they believe heroically in opposing fascism, because they know the people they're attacking aren't real Nazis or real fascists. They're just free speech advocates or whatever. So it's just their way of allowing aggressive political violence against their enemies in a way that they think they're going to get away with it, right? So fundamentally, the left has for a long time thought that violence was never the answer, right? And that's just not true. There are lots of times when violence can be the answer. And violence for a heroic cause is an answer, right? So if you're going into the caves of chaos, and part of the reason you're going into the caves of chaos is to protect the human villages that are going to be raided by these monsters, that is violence with a purpose, right? Even if at the same time you're going there to enrich yourself too, right? The fighting that went on in the 100 Years' War and the War of the Roses might seem senseless to the sensibilities of a modernist, but it certainly wasn't at that time, because what you were talking about there is the divine right of kings, defending the rights of the crown. There was all of these elements involved that were extremely important, and it didn't mean that everybody was just naively, because there was obviously a human element to this, of personal profit. There was the opposition to corruption, right? There was even in the War of the Roses the question of, a kind of a mandate of heaven, right? Like, is a person worthy of rule when they've screwed up enormously? Is a mad king someone you have to keep on the throne? Is it excusable when it corrupts the whole kingdom? Or is the fact that he was never meant to be the lineage holder in the first place proof that this corruption is not something that should be tolerated, right? All these sorts of questions, these are profound questions, right? These are things that can become important and valuable fodder in the game. So that was what I wanted to talk about today. Basically, that when people tell you, oh, you shouldn't have too much combat in D&D, or you shouldn't be violent in RPGs, they're lying, and they're just being stupid. But that it opens up a worthwhile conversation about exactly what type of violence you can have in D&D to make it more exciting or better or more interesting. That's definitely worthwhile. So if you like this video, again, please support me on Patreon or on PayPal. I'm gonna have a link below in the blog. Where you'll be able to send to my to donate to my PayPal via my blog, I'm just checking the notes here to see if there's yeah, here Big Fat Polly says violence has never solved anything except World War II, the Cold War, the American Civil War, and the Star Wars trilogy. Exactly. Very, very good. Yeah, and share the videos. Again, we've now passed 700 subscribers. Things keep moving faster, and I'm really grateful. I think that it's clear to me that that's a sign that there's people here who like, what I'm talking about. And I hope that you'll keep sharing these videos. Share this video. Share all the videos. Anywhere that you think you're going to get somebody interested to subscribe, where we can talk about this sort of stuff. And if you want me to make, more live streams in the future, send some kind of big donation. If you want me to make a live stream that I will schedule ahead of time, so that people will actually know when it's happening, and so I want to basically encourage me not to be such a screw up. All right, I guess that's it for today, and thank you for watching. Currently smoking, what is this? A Moretti Rhodesian plus Barking Dog.